Thank you, Rosemary, for that lovely introduction. I feel like I'm doing a bit of false advertising here because this was actually a talk I gave at Taituara gathering of local government professionals about 3 weeks ago. It was a great gathering, by the way. And I'm not giving this talk, but I'm going to get to it later in mine. I don't have a lot of slides. My colleagues Francis and Kay have a lot of slides, so I'm going to read some notes off my laptop. It's very hard juggling one phone and two laptops in the same small space. And then I'll get to something more specific. I do have a slide, but I'm not going to bamboozle you with a whole bunch of them today. So thank you, Rosemary and others, for inviting me to take part in this panel today to provide a perspective on a population policy for Aotearoa New Zealand. I'm actually really pleased to be here amongst old friends to celebrate 50 years of PANZ. And I'm very much thinking of our dear late friend and colleague, Emeritus Professor Ian Poole, who made such a mark at the University of Waikato and on my own career trajectory. He was always guaranteed to bring some liveliness to the proceedings. You know, he brought the juice in his own fashion, as well as, of course, Professor Natalie Jackson, who was unable to be with us today, but who looms large, I think, over PANZ. And just the quality of her scholarship in the last couple of decades. I think since we're also in celebration mode, I want to acknowledge the graduation this week of Dr. Moana Rarere. She received her PhD in demography at the University of Waikato on Tuesday. I believe Moana is the first tangata Māori who to receive a PhD in demography here in Aotearoa. I'm pretty sure you are. I'm not 100%, but I'm 99% sure. And her thesis, Understanding Contemporary Māori Demographic Fertility Patterns and Trends in Aotearoa, had the rare distinction of being passed without any emendations, which is magnificent actually for any student. So ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Moana, we're really proud of you. So I just wanted to note that, even though I know you wouldn't want me to note that, I'm going to note it anyway. Really enjoyed listening to the reflections of our more seasoned PANZ Life members earlier in the earlier session. I think it really evokes a whole lot of personal and collective memories, which is so important, and the expertise. I actually think PANZ needs to do an oral history project with our living PANZ Life members, because the collective knowledge and insights that you hold is actually so critical for the sorts of things we're trying to grapple with. So we'll come back to you to get your informed consent. I think at some future date, as I was just listening, I was thinking that's such an important project. So yes, we should celebrate the endurance and the resilience of PANZ, but I also kind of look around the room. I'm not sure what the median age is. I'm sure Kim Dunstan can compute it really quickly for us. I don't see a lot of young people, and with some of the structural challenges that we're facing in the university sector, where we're getting really squeezed, but also in the public service. I don't think we can take for granted that the liveliness and the depth of scholarship and advocacy and at times activism that has really enabled PANZ to endure, that we can't take that for granted, I think, moving forward. And I think, as Len so eloquently said, now more than ever, we actually need a really strong population lens in our policy and planning. So I think that's a bit of a challenge, actually, for PANZ going forward. So the kaupapa for us today is to discuss perspectives on a population policy, and that begs the wider question, do we need a population policy for Aotearoa? If yes, what would that even begin to look like? This is a really old question. You've probably all written about this multiple times over multiple decades, so it's not new.
Also in the population review.
It's also in the population review. I don't know, maybe it was one of the first questions asked at the inaugural PANZ gathering 50 years ago. But it's a question, that gets asked at least once a decade. It pops up. It gets some airtime, it gets a flurry of activity and focus, but there never really seems to be a serious reckoning with that question. And I think most of you gathered here would agree that population matters. It matters very much, and having an understanding of it matters. Len laid that out in a very clear way, and so did Robert. And certainly in a global context, population and population policy is seen as absolutely pivotal to development and national and regional economies. So as some of you will know, since 1976, the UNPD, the UN Population Division, has canvassed countries on population policies through a range of ways, including its official inquiry that it undertakes every 5 years. It's been doing the quinquennial survey since 1963, and the purpose of that is to help monitor internationally agreed development goals, including the MDGs more recently, and now the SDGs. So the matter of population policy is taken quite seriously in other countries. I don't think we can say that's the case here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So as we do, late at night, we go down rabbit holes and start downloading all the different PDFs of the different inquiries undertaken by the UNPD. And so I had a look at the 11th inquiry, which was in 2014, focused on 3 areas. One was population size, growth and distribution. One was fertility, family planning and reproductive health, and one was international migration. And the first question in that inquiry was very simple. It was, does the government have a national population policy or another national policy that specifically addresses population issues? Yes or no? Second question, is there a government department or agency responsible for formulating, coordinating or implementing population policies? Yes or no? And then the third one, has a government incorporated population trends into current national development plans or strategies? So I think if we posed those questions now here in Aotearoa, the answer to the first 2 would be a resounding no. And the third would be maybe, patchy, dependent on the institutional and internal capability and capacity of the various departments. I know, Len, that in the past you've been really sceptical of government departments' capacity and capability to bring a population lens, but of course you've acknowledged that there are some that are doing it and trying to do it. However, I would argue that an itsy-bitsy approach across government agencies is not a population policy, nor is it a coherent population approach that puts population at the centre of planning. And if we want to address the issues seriously that Francis, Kay and others have touched on, we actually need to do better. And I guess the challenge is, what's the role of PANZ? Because in the current political environment, this is not a beat up on the government fest. It's, we all know what's going on. But we can't look to government to drive this kaupapa. And is there a role for PANZ? I was very interested, Arvin, who was talking about the inaugural PANZ Council making the submission to the Royal Inquiry on Abortion. And that was very active in pulling together substantive pieces of work. And so if we as a community agree that something needs to be done in this area, perhaps there's also a role for PANZ, leadership-wise, to produce something that enables that momentum to carry forward in a political context where it's very challenging. There's no real interest in evidence-based policy making, let alone population-centric policy making, and it's simply not going to manifest itself. So I don't have a solution to that, but I think it's a question that it's good to reflect on. I went back and read the New Zealand Population Change, Composition and Policy Implications report by the Population Monitoring Group of the New Zealand Planning Council in 1986. Ian was there, Dirk, you were there, Peggy Koopman-Boyden, Jacques, Ruth Farmer and Mansell Kwaja. What an amazing piece of work. So comprehensive, so rigorous, and so insightful. I don't believe we've had much of that magnitude. I know Len talked about a little bit about it, about the pieces of work that have come out, but nothing really substantial. Perhaps we need something substantial like that. I mean, there's a few observations in there that didn't age well. One of them was that TFR appears to be levelling out at 1.9, and a recovery in fertility rates to replacement level in the medium term cannot be ruled out, but I think we can rule it out. shared a post on LinkedIn this morning from Australia where Australian fertility is now, I think, 1.5, and the state of Victoria was at 1.3. So it's only going one way, and it's sort of down. I guess the question is how far down will it go and at what pace? So, and one of the other key messages from that I thought was very germane is that policy approaches sort of sometimes get fixated on numbers, but that population composition rather than growth per se is actually much more important. And I think that observation has aged very well, but it perhaps hasn't been taken as seriously as it should be. So what have we seen in recent years? You might cast your mind back to 12 years ago. There was a report by NZIER. Do you remember that? Called Grow For It. And the key premise of that report was that we should commit actively to growing the Aotearoa New Zealand population to reach 15 million in the next 50 years, so an annual growth rate of 2.5% per annum, and that would bring the size and density of the population to levels closer to more prosperous European countries. So pull that migration lever hard. Pull it, and keep pulling it. That basically was the premise of the report. That was an interesting lens, I think, on population. There was the 2013 Royal Society report, Our Futures Te Pai Tawhiti. Remember, Dick, you and I were part of that on 2013 census and New Zealand's changing population. That was more, I think, a descriptive piece of work rather than having any really sort of hard-hitting recommendations about what we should do about these changes. And of course, the Productivity Commission, before it was legislatively disestablished, recently undertook an inquiry into what immigration policy settings would best facilitate Aotearoa's long-term economic growth and promote the well-being of New Zealanders, so bringing forward that Treasury well-being lens into population and immigration settings. So I'm not going to say anything about immigration. I know Francis will talk to that with his expertise, and of course the Retirement Commission, Ngā Mihi Jane, has done a lot of work in this area as well. So there've been reports that touch on population, but not the sort of sustained population focus that I think perhaps we're all interested in. I'm not going to go over the state of population in Aotearoa. We all know issues of sub-replacement fertility for many decades. Māori TFR is now below replacement. That's been fairly recent. Is it going to keep going down? No idea. Moana knows though. So Moana will answer your questions later on. Migration, of course, extremely volatile, net loss of New Zealand citizens to Australia, but then we've had major gains from other parts of the world. It's highly complicated, and Francis is going to talk to that. Structural ageing, in the 2023 census, 41 of our 67 TAs had more older people aged 65 and older than we did tamariki, 0 to 14. That's a historic first since, of course, colonial times. Spatial distribution, regional divergence, the lived realities and the opportunity structures of growing up Māori in Gisborne are a world away from growing up as Pākehā in one of the more affluent suburbs of Tāmaki Makaurau or Queenstown. This regional divergence is real. The one-size-fits-all of Aotearoa is a construction, social construction, sociological. Regional divergence is so important for us to grapple with, and of course intergenerational and ethnic inequities that I think Kay will speak to as well. What are we doing about it? Bugger all, actually. What might the important dimensions of a population policy, either a single policy or a population approach across a suite of policies that influence or respond to population change, what would they look like? Is it enough to just tinker around and do a whole lot of population policy type things, or do we need a principled approach to this, underpinned by a set of shared values about what we want the sort of Aotearoa that we want our mokopuna and future mokopuna to experience and to live in, and what might those values be? Do we still need to get real and have concrete numbers or a range of numbers? It's sort of hard to talk about immigration settings with no numbers in mind. And where does te tiriti fit? I mean, I know the government wants to erase te tiriti. Where does te tiriti fit in our population thinking? because this is Aotearoa, it's not another country, it's Aotearoa, and Te Tiriti is the constitutional foundations and of partnership for Aotearoa. I put this slide up so I should get to it. So this is what excites me when I think about what the future population looks like. When my great-grandfather was born in 1880, his people were dying around him, and I know that I've done a big research project, documenting whole whakapapa lines disappearing. And at that low point of 1960 census, about 45,000 Māori, the future looked bleak. It looked bloody bleak. Fast forward to 2023, we have nearly 1 million people of New Zealanders of Māori descent, and then of course we have at least another 200,000 Māori diaspora. So we've gone from, smooth the dying polo of the Māori race to 1 million Māori. What's the potential for that? We're not in 1950s New Zealand anymore. We're in 2023 Aotearoa. Even if people don't want that to change, it has changed. And demography will march on. And my daughter's generation are a world away from my grandparents' generation. They will not stand by quietly and watch things roll on. That they won't be erased. They won't be erased. So demographically, we're here to stay. What are the population policies that ensure that, at least for our Indigenous population, and what is good for Māori, I believe is good for Aotearoa, to move from survival to thriving, And so if that principled approach is that we want an Aotearoa that is thriving, where we have zero tolerance for intergenerational equity, where we have zero tolerance for tamariki living in poverty, where we have, zero tolerance for the sorts of things that are pulling communities apart, what is our role in that? Because we're not just about crunching numbers, and we're not just about doing modelling. If we are leaders in the space of population and population-informed planning and development, then we need to think about these bigger, more tricky issues as well. So I think that's the end. My 1 minute went 5 minutes ago. And I don't want to get too much into the nitty-gritty, but I think, is that going to be a segue? I would have loved to talk about the census, but Kay's going to talk about the census, aren't you, Kay? And I think Francis will take up the mantle on matters migration as well. So I'll draw a line under it there. Thank you. And sorry, wrong laptop closed. I'll reopen that. Do I need to log back in again? Sorry. Oh, can I make my comment on the census? Oh, because I've got a captured audience. Oh, okay, thank you. Well, I think Len already alluded to some of the changes with the census, and we've probably all been involved in some sort of level of consultation with the census transformation. I guess, New Zealand likes to promote itself as being one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world, sitting alongside Israel and Estonia and some of those other countries, and that may be true to a certain extent. I guess my concern is when it comes to the census, Stats NZ is kind of playing God, and there's a lot of things that could go wrong with that. And I think from someone who's worked with Māori population data for quite some time, we saw very palpably the effects of what happens when things go wrong. So the 2018 census went wrong, and we were missing a whole lot of data, and there was a patch-up job on the census data set. The 2023 census didn't go that great either. I mean, I was saying about 25% of Māori were missed from the census field enumeration. We're being in a period of transformation and changing things sort of on the fly. I think you can have some real casualties from that. So I'm just very concerned what the quality of the data is going to look like once we move from an enumeration-based model or a combined model to one that is purely based on administrative data. And I know you're going to do the password. I guess the one thing about that too is that there's sort of been a level of high trust in Stats to do the work that it does. But with the shift to an administrative model, it relies a lot on social licence. And I think that is a really shaky ground on which to build a new paradigm of census taking when most New Zealanders are blissfully unaware of how their administrative data is being used and reused, regardless of whether it's census purpose or any other purpose. So I guess I'm concerned that taking a very narrow lens of we can do it, so therefore we will do it, and not paying attention to the broader social issues that could potentially unwind that in a spectacular way. Would you like to log in now?
Oh, we logged in.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to leave that to Kay to carry on that conversation.
Kia ora Tahu, for the wonderful talk and kōrero around population, and I guess thank you everyone for the opportunity to be here and speak to you. I'm going to start by telling you all that I'm on strike. So I considered the possibility of going to sit down after putting that slide up, but I've chosen, somewhat torn as a committed member of the Tertiary Education Union, that given this is the 50th anniversary, I'll still continue being here with the talk. But I thought, in addition to showing you the strike sign, that I might also highlight off the back of continued industrial action at higher education institutions in this country the significance of demography, yes, but also the ways in which political responses to demography shape the conditions within institutions and what happens next. So the institutions in this country of higher education have been struggling financially, many of them in different sorts of ways, and that has been used in part to shape what happens with staff and with students in terms of the willingness to negotiate with staff in terms of pay negotiations, but also restructuring that leads to the loss of jobs for many staff and the loss of expertise that go with that. Those haven't emerged out of nowhere. They've emerged out of a higher education system that became focused on particular demographic situations in terms of composition, and not only around population of New Zealand citizens, but also around migration in terms of international students. At universities in this country and polytechnics and others became oriented over the last few decades around profitable international student migration that has now become uncertain. And so I think this is, in some ways, although I don't have a detailed analysis of this, I think it's worth thinking about how particular settings in the institutions within which we work also relate to having a good understanding of demographic change that PANZ and others can offer up, but also the political responses to population composition and change over time. So, starting with that and acknowledging that. I've been asked to talk about immigration, which is convenient because I don't really have an enormous amount of expertise in other areas of demography and population. And as many of you who know me will know, I don't have either training or particular expertise in the areas of demography. But I have become, I guess, over the course of my career, increasingly associated with organisations like PANZ, but also engaged in population-related research. And that's come from my background as a sociologist and geographer who's focused particularly on immigration issues, around thinking through how things like immigration fit into broader understandings of governing population and the implications of this question of policy or politics around immigration. So that's what I'm going to focus on here today. Len, you might recognise the image in the background here. So in digging for PDFs, like Tahu also did, I dug for PDFs and found various images, and we'll see the image of this report in a moment too. This is, of course, the human face report from 1990, was it? Yeah. So what I want to do, though, I guess, is rather than talking about population policy per se, is to unpack the fact that immigration policy in this country, in the absence of a formalised population policy, has been seen as a de facto population policy, which I think is quite problematic in many ways. But I want to unpack what that means. If immigration policy has been seen as a de facto population policy, what does that mean, and what has immigration policy been like? So much of what I'm going to talk about is probably not news to you all, but I think it's worth highlighting, and I think it's worth naming, in particular in relation to this question that Tahu raises around what values do we have around around population in this country, because that's kind of where I'm interested, because I think that's one of the key transformations that have occurred in immigration in this country over recent decades. It's particular shifts in value, and particular in values, should I say, and particular shifts in particular in the rights of people who arrive in this country as immigrants, which I think have problematic consequences for society more broadly. So we'll come to that. I did have a few slides that said, everyone talks about population policy. Again, as Tahu said, it's not new. This is kind of a question that's been raised like for decades. Paul Spoonley, a couple of years ago with this book, with his own quote there saying we need to think about population again. Countless articles you can find that's in the last 2 or 3 years that say we need to talk about population and population policy again. That's great that there's a focus on population. Not exactly clear where that ends up, I think is possibly worth noting. And Tahu already got ahead of me and named most of these reports that are listed up here. So the Human Face Report and others that were listed. I went slightly further back though, to the Dominion Population Committee. Which is somewhat convenient for the next slides I'll bring up. So the Dominion Population Committee in 1946 was tasked with finding ways to grow the New Zealand population. And unlike some of these other reports, this was a mammoth 144 pages, which did canvass fertility, did changes, did canvass migration, did canvass a whole range of issues, including race allegiance, and the place of Māori, and a range of other sorts of foci that probably would be unlikely to appear in more recent publications. But for me, I put that up there because if I think about immigration policy as de facto population policy in this country, then the first thing to say is that for a significant period of time post the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, immigration policy was settler colonial population policy. It was explicitly designed to displace Māori as the dominant people of this place and to establish demographic and political dominance, in contravention of exactly the preamble and the agreements in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and even the Treaty of Waitangi, in terms of the protections that are laid out there. So I don't need to reiterate that for everyone here. And Tahu, and in particular your chapter with Arama from a few years ago, laid out the absence of consideration of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in relation to immigration policy in this country since 1840. So the treaty is preambled with a focus on immigration, and yet that has not been, the treaty and Māori perspectives on immigration have not been incorporated into our discussions of immigration policy. But immigration policy has nonetheless populated or shifted the population composition of New Zealand radically over the course of the 19th and 20th century. And to come back to the 1940s and 1950s and that era, the golden era of a certain kind, by the time we've reached post-World War II, New Zealand has been constituted as a white dominion, which I think is explicitly stated very clearly here, the outcome of immigration policy as a kind of settler colonial population policy is stated very bluntly here. Our immigration is based firmly on the principle that we are and intend to remain a country of European development. Now, Māori are not mentioned here, but obviously that appears implicit that the settler colonial white demographic dominance has already been established, and that also New Zealand would not be a place that would entertain immigration of people from other places. Now, as everyone knows, or everyone in this room knows, immigration policy in this country has shifted enormously since that point in time, and the experts who gave account for some of those shifts are in this room here, and I have I owe a lot of credit to their insights, Richard in particular, but others in this room, around understanding shifts in immigration policy over the last few decades. But I do want to just kind of highlight one chart here. So we know the general narrative that's told of immigration policy change in this country. In the 1980s, the Labor government led a shift in immigration policy that meant that sort of formalised the shift away from traditional source countries, as Britain and Ireland, as the source of migrants in New Zealand, and that over the course of the 1990s and beyond, immigration both increased and also diversified. I think it's important, however, to also situate that immigration shift in relation to immigration. And while people, again, in this room will be very familiar with this, I find that in public discourse, that's not something that is actually thought about alongside each other. So I was asked to be on the wonderful News Talk ZB last week to talk about net loss of New Zealand citizens. And the interviewer asked me sometime after we'd started to talk about it, so does this mean the New Zealand population is shrinking? When we talked about the very high level of net loss of New Zealand citizens in 2024. To which I said, well, no, because there's also actually quite a significant net gain overall around migration, which includes non-citizens. These conversations are not often brought together. Why does that matter? Well, I think it matters really for one reason. It's for a lot of reasons, but one reason that I want to highlight here. And that is that over the course of particularly the last 2 decades, our immigration policy has shifted from being a more diverse and more high volume migration policy towards one that increasingly creates precarious situations for people who enter into this country. In other words, to sum it up briefly, and I could stop here, but I won't, New Zealand citizens immigrate over long periods of time at relatively high, cyclically changing, yes, but relatively high levels. Over 900,000 net loss of New Zealand citizens in the last 40 years, or 45 years. And we have had continued net immigration gains of people in recent years who have increasingly arrived into this country without full rights to come with their family, without necessarily having access to health, education for their children if their children are able to come, possibly only here for a number of years and then possibly having to move on elsewhere, subject to increased levels of exploitation in workplaces, and a whole range of other issues that occur when you're not a citizen. So the question of immigration numbers, I think, is an absolutely valid one that we need to be having. But for me, the question also, and the end with that, is the question of what are the values around immigration settings. And I think immigration settings and policy is actually really, really problematic in this country. And I suppose to respond to, or to add on to Tahu's point earlier, you made the point, what are we doing about it? Nothing. In the space of immigration policy, I would say, what are we doing about it? More of the same. Yeah, and more of the same quite problematic approaches, certainly of the last decade. So for me, just to kind of, I guess, again, this will be familiar to many people in this room, but I think it's worth highlighting the ways in which our immigration system has shifted from one where, broadly speaking, people who arrived in New Zealand arrived on residence permits and largely had a lot of the rights that we associate with citizenship or could acquire citizenship, towards a situation of extraordinary stratification between people in different types of position. So this is an adapted chart that I put in a chapter from a few years ago, but where we can imagine a kind of continuum, and this is schematic rather than specific, but a continuum from citizenship at the top, where we assume certain kinds of permanent established rights, electoral rights, the ability to reside indefinitely, freedom to move between employers without asking permission, access to health, education, social security, family reunification, and so on, through to very temporary limited rights, where absolutely we would have to put the RSE scheme at the most restricted end. But actually, from my perspective, some of the recent changes in the shift towards an accredited employer work visa scheme have amplified or increased the number of people who are likely to be subject to more restrictive rights. And I think anyone who followed the news late last year would recognise what a disaster the accredited employer work visa scheme was in terms of the exposure of people to workplace exploitation and migration fraud. And in fact, from my perspective, actually, there are elements of the design of that work visa scheme that created a marketplace for exploitation. Work visa policies have created a marketplace for migrants for some time, but I think that scheme actually created a marketplace for workplace exploitation, so that it was a tradable commodity. And you can see that in the fact that employers had to get tokens in order to recruit workers, but could trade those tokens from one employer to another. So really, really problematic settings. And those problematic settings for me come back to the values that are associated with immigration policy, such that it has become focused on, yes, maintaining access to labour, but in doing so increasingly framing migrants as only labour, or certain migrants as only labour. And you have to be further up this category in order to be deemed to be more worthy. So if this level of stratification is what shapes immigration policy as de facto population policy, then I think this is extraordinarily problematic and does not suggest the kinds of values-based approach to policy making that we would want to have in a future-focused Aotearoa New Zealand. And I think, I completely agree and concur with Tahu's point around what's good for Māori is good for Aotearoa as a whole. I'd ask the question, where does this sit within a vision? Where does our approach to immigration sit within a vision for enhancing the well-being of everyone? And again, come back to that question, what would be a Te Tiriti-centred focused immigration policy? Not one necessarily for me to answer, but what would be a Māori perspective on immigration policy, in relation to how it is here. But whatever immigration policy is as a de facto population policy, it's currently not what we want it to be. And I'm going to leave it there.
Kia ora tātou. Thanks very much for a fascinating day already and quite a lot of nostalgia going on. I am not a population specialist. So I'll tell you that right now. Even ageing populations, I'm not a specialist in that. What I'm a specialist is really about being a generalist and focusing on housing and our urban society, if you like, rural and urban societies, and how that comes together. So when I was asked to do this, I thought, oh God, what do I remember about demography? And actually it's quite a lot because it's so important. And so one of the things that I was thinking about is, what do I want to say about where our population sits? And how does that relate to the things that I am very concerned about most of the time, which is housing? And it occurred to me that really our future relies on three sort of forms of infrastructure, not about pipes, but essentially they have very similar things, whether you're talking about the housing stock, which is a piece of our infrastructure, a bit of our kit for our society. Our population, as Adam Smith said, it is the wealth of nations, and our environment. I'm not going to talk so much about the environment, but it's already been mentioned that population and the environment is incredibly important. But put those three things together, that's our future. And what interests me when I think about this is actually a lot of the stuff and what goes on in those sets of infrastructure, if you like, is relatively predictable. We have relatively predictable change because the past does in fact drive much of the future. There's shocks and there's changes in policy and so forth, but actually they have their own logic. So when I think about, for instance, housing stocks, we have life cycles of dwellings. They last a certain period of time. We have births and deaths of dwellings, and they're an intergenerational product. They're passed on from generation to generation in a variety of different ways. And what's really interesting about housing policy in New Zealand, we always treat the house as though it somehow just reflects or deals with the people who live in it right now. But actually, it's going to be there for another probably 80 years, 120 years if it's a villa. If it's a high rise, it might squeeze out 50 years. Might. We'll see, and I'll talk about that again. But it's sort of pretty predictable how dwellings move through and interface with our population, just in the same way that our people have rates of fertility, and we have deaths, and we have births, and I've got that round the wrong way, but sometimes it feels like at the moment. So it's actually quite predictable, but it's largely ignored. We haven't planned around the predictability of these really important parts of the things that make our lives, shape our lives, condition our lives, and lead our generations from one place into the future. And in ignoring those, if you like, the predictable nature, which then also allows us to understand shocks and understand cycles, ignoring the predictable nature of these bits of infrastructure, falling back, and as we have, on the market, means that we often really focus on cyclical fluctuations and from a policy point of view respond to those, there's more time put into tiny little changes in our interest rates than there is around our big structural change in terms of house prices, house building, and loss of houses where people are. And despite the uptick in the 2023 census on owner occupation, it's yet to be demonstrated to me exactly why that's happened. So I'm looking forward to that because it's a really interesting thing. But I think it's less meaningful than it looks. So I won't go on too much about that. So we come very much preoccupied by cyclical movements. We often miss structural change. And when we miss structural change, we often miss the impact, the real impact of shocks. And so let me just give you an example of that. I became the chief, and I'm speaking as me, Director of Crescent, not as the Chief Science Advisor, I better just add. I became the Chief Science Advisor at HUD the day I took up the position, the day after the first COVID lockdown. So I was at home in Marlborough on my computer, and winging through the airways came this question which said, "Kay, what is the impact that COVID's going to have on house prices?" So I wrote back, I don't think it will have much of an impact on house prices. I think we're going to see house prices continue on. In the meantime, across the media and within certain agencies, there was this huge anxiety that the whole of house prices were going to collapse in New Zealand. We would have people were facing negative equity. They were going to be chucked out of their homes, etc., etc., etc. Why did and of course, so those predictions of house price collapse were between about 10% to an extreme end of 30%. So there was that, and actually, I was thinking, actually, it'd be great if house prices reduced by 30%. We'd actually get some affordability in there. That would be good, you know. And what happened? Actually, house prices kept on increasing. Didn't fall. Certainly didn't fall at all. Slight suppression in the rise in prices, but that was it. The reason for that? Because our housing market had changed. And who were the big players and drivers in the buying and selling of stock, therefore setting price? They were property investors. They weren't families, they weren't households, they were property investors, and I'll come back to that point. That's a huge structural change, and it's often missed when we look at population and owner occupation. So I've become increasingly interested in what is a structural change as opposed to a cyclical change. And in a structural change, what I mean is that they tend to be sort of secular. They're in and of themselves. They have a relatively low correlation with fluctuations in domestic and global conditions, not unaffected by them, but they're just not well correlated with them. They tend to be self-perpetuating. Once you get that structural shift, they keep on going. They create structural conditions that mean that the cycles have different impacts, and I've just talked about that a minute ago. And they tend to interact with other structural shifts. And in housing, the structural shift of housing and demography is a really, really critical one. And one of the things that when we look at, for instance, owner occupation for Pacific peoples and for Māori, is that this isn't a world in which Māori or Pacific didn't care about home ownership because they had some sort of cultural desire not to own homes. This was a situation that where those populations were in their demography, they actually reaped the benefit of the investment in home ownership, but it had very little impact on the population as a whole. And as Natalie Jackson pointed out to me, and I went, oh yes, Natalie, you're right, you know, because I hadn't thought about it, so I'm not claiming this as my own. She says, okay, you've got to remember, when we invested in owner occupation in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the Pākehā population was young, and demographically they are similar to Māori, the Māori population now. But the Māori population, in bearing and rearing, doesn't have the advantage of that huge investment into owner occupation and support for good housing. So this has nothing to do with, who are the little squirrels that put away their nuts for the future or anything like that. This is a straight interaction between demography and changes in policy. And we don't spend enough time thinking about those. Then the other big structural change, and coming back to home ownership, just on that graph, I just want to indicate to you the importance of property investors in the housing market. So at one end of it you'll see the period 1986 to 1991, and you'll look at private rental dwellings. This is how much the stock is owned by which category of peoples. And there's other rental dwellings and there's total occupied dwellings at the bottom. And there's the change in those 5-year inter-census periods. And you can see that, in fact, property bought and concentrated in private rental ownership has had a huge impact, has actually dominated that movement across from 1986, 191%, the concentration of the stock, not households, the difficulties around that, the stock went up around 191% for private property investors between 1986 and 2018. That's a huge structural change because that stock is not available. In the old days, rental and ownership used to churn, the stock used to churn constantly between rental and, be in rent for a little while and then it go back into home. That's not what's happening now. That structural change means that stock is used for something different, including how prices are set, than it was 30 years ago. If we don't take that into account, we don't really understand what's going on. And then, of course, Natalie's cohort analysis of owner occupation, I have to say, I really hate the tendency for some people within government agencies to talk about vulnerable people or people who are marginalised or precarious as a cohort. This is a weird use of the word cohort, and it's absolutely, thank you, misuse. So when I'm at various places, I bang on this continuously, and you can see the eyes glazing over. So that's not a cohort. It might be a segment, it might be a subpopulation, but it is not a cohort. But actually what it reflects is the notion that if you're in a situation, you're not going to change. It's actually part of a reinforcement of if you are in a precarious situation, that's somehow about you, not around the structures around you, and therefore we're going to label you as a cohort. So anyhow, that's my little rave there. But what you see here, which is the great eyebrow graph, as I like to see it, at one end, this is 5-year cohorts according to age of birth and so forth, and you can see those born in the latest cohort on this particular graph is in 2007-2013. These are people that start off with relatively low levels of owner occupation, so they're born into rental households and not born into owner-occupied households, compared with earlier generations. So if you go up that axis, you'll see those earlier generations. And what typically happened is people were born in an owner-occupied dwelling, they sort of hit their university years or leaving home for trades, etc., etc. There was a fall in owner occupation, then they bounced back into owner occupation. And so if you were lucky enough to be born in, for instance, 1927-31, 87% of people at age 65 would be in owner occupation. You can't tell me that's not about egalitarianism, which absolutely runs counter to the view that owner occupation, the investment in owner occupation, is inegalitarian. One could argue that what happened to that group was a form of really effective social investment. And what happened for Māori and Pacific, of course, is that demographically, they sort of missed out on that. Not individuals in those cohorts, but demographically as a population. And that's one of the problems that we see. And we know it's a structural change because we've got now an increase in the proportion of the population in what we call the intermediate housing market. And the intermediate housing market is those groups, and you can see the nice red and green graph prepared by Ian Mitchell, going from 1991 to 2022. The green is Auckland, the red is Aotearoa, and you can see that's the numbers of people in the intermediate housing market. Those are the people who can't get access to social housing, but nor can they get access to owner occupation at the lowest priced quartile. So they're in this market where they swirl around. And that has gone up in those 3 decades about 240, almost 250%, with an annual growth rate of 4.1%. That's a huge population of people there without choice. And so if we think about our population dynamics, it's not just a matter of what is our population, which I think is the point Kahu, both you and Francis made. It's not just a matter of what is the demography going on, what are the numbers here? It's the conditions in which our population finds itself and how those conditions play out for different cohorts over time and why they do that. So why do they do that? Because of a housing shock. And was it a cyclical housing shock? No, it wasn't. It was a paradigmatic shift in the 1990s. This graph, which I've shown on many occasions, in the red bars is all the capital assistance directed to new builds by governments from 1960 to 2012. So it goes up like this. Took me an awful lot of time preparing this graph, I have to say. And in the purple line there, you'll see the percentage of new builds built priced at lower quartile value. That is an amazing, you can see it all happening. You've got a bit of lag time there, you've got things happening. But you can see why we've now got a housing crisis, because 1960, over 30% of our houses were built to be priced at the lowest quartile, last 25%. By 2012, we've got less than, I think it's about 8%, I can't quite remember, but it's in that region, it's almost minuscule. So these things relate to each other in really important ways. So a population policy also needs to be thinking about our environmental policy and our housing policy. And the last thing is, because I promised it, Tahu said, it's all right, I'm going to rat on about the census. So this is what I'm going to say. So you just have to bear with me for a little bit. The hint about the census is in the name. It is not a census of population and another census of dwellings. It's a population and dwelling census. It's about how individuals relate to families, relate to households, relate to dwellings, relate to place. And it's all lined up in a chain. And if you don't get that, you've got a problem. It's terribly expensive putting little bits of data together and pretending it's robust, because it won't be robust. But if you also don't take that as really important, and it is going to be the basis for, should be the basis for much of our policy, is that you have a window into the future if it's through sample surveys, unrobust, if you have administrative data, you have a window into the future which is the past, is the experiences of the past. Everything is an experience of past in a sense, but the census picks up shifts. And that's why you can do an analysis and say, goodness me, the concentration of our stock ownership in New Zealand has moved from owner-occupiers to property investors, private property investors. What does that mean? We don't do that analysis a lot, but we don't. So for me, the challenge is not can we find different ways of learning about populations and dwellings, is we have to preserve the ability to understand that chain in a robust way. And I'm saying this because I'm very, very grumpy about this at the moment. So that's all I've got to say on these. So thank you.
So I just want to say a big thank you to all three of our panellists. I think you've all brought out things that are thought-provoking, greatly important, and to me encapsulates the importance of really understanding our past, our present, and having really good, robust structures for the future, and regardless of what it is. So we have a bit of time now for some questions, and I just want to say, Kay, I agree with you. I think the home ownership thing is complex, and I did talk about it at the Housing Stats Use Group yesterday, so happy to have a conversation and unpick it later on. But in the meantime, I'd like to open up the floor. So I think we've got like 20 minutes for questions. We can probably be a little bit flexible around that, but I know that a couple of people do have some time constraints. So if you'd like to put up your hand, we have Mike with the mic. The magic mic, sorry, we'll think of any more mic jokes while you're thinking of your questions. So have anyone who would like to start with a question?
Paper by Ted Douglas reporting on the 1975 population conference, and he reminded us that abortion, retirement age, taxation policy, home ownership issues as discussed, and a whole myriad of other things were fundamentally population policy. And I think that that's something that which you've really reminded us. It's quite important that when we don't really think about it, we're ignoring and we're disowning what happens there. And I think that's something that we've got a real responsibility for. When we stuff it up, we stuff up a lot of other things.
Just to pick up on Len's point, I think this question, do we need a population policy, is a bit of a dead-end question. The real issue is what are the problems that are generated by either lack of population, too rapid a population growth, or population growth of a particular kind. And I think what we should be doing is focusing on those problems that are caused by demographic patterns, rather than saying, should we have a population policy, because it's putting the cart before the horse. Unless you identify what the problems are first that result from demographic processes, then you're not really in a position to talk about population policy. So what I'd like to do is focus on what are the key issues that we as a group, probably the most knowledgeable cluster of people on population in New Zealand at the moment, what do we think are the most critical problems to which a demographic shift might be relevant? Okay, it could be, do we need more childcare? Do we need greater assistance by government to encourage young families to have more children? Is that the issue? Is the problem of how do we cope with superannuation? How do we cope with poverty in older people? Is that the issue? Once we find the problem, identify the problem, then we can work backwards to the demographic factors that are actually responsible. And that way I think you're going to get an audience that's much more likely to listen, because you're talking about the things that actually affect them. Population policy, God, it's a sleeper. Talk about childcare, talk about child poverty, talk about how thousands and thousands of older people are living just on a pension, then you galvanise an audience. then you can start talking about things that matter demographically. That's my point.
Oh, yeah, I'll make a comment on that, Phil, thanks. In some ways, I entirely disagree with you. In some ways, I entirely disagree with you. So I'm going to, the usual ambivalence that one has on these things. The thing that really strikes me that is important, not necessarily around having a policy, but having a population understanding, is the fact that that there is a generational dynamic which continues on, and understanding what other policies do in relation to that generational dynamic are really important. So the issue, for instance, about the adequacy, I mean, Jane, sorry, you might well completely disagree with me in a minute, but the issue that we have in terms around retirement incomes are absolutely tied both to ageing populations, but also substantial change in our housing policy. And so what we had was an assumption that older people, seniors, would come into their retirement years, and let's not worry about who's working and who's not for paid work, being both mortgage-free, and you know all this stuff backwards, Phil, but mortgage-free and in their own home. And that allowed a degree of adequacy in the pension system that it simply doesn't do anymore, as we see the flow of both the ageing of the population, but that population ageing in rent. And so it's the integration between, the interplay between those that I think is really important. And a lot of people literally do not understand that. So I had a situation a couple of years ago when we were doing the LTIB on the structural ageing and the impact for housing. Someone said to me, Kay, but once we're over this blip of older people, it will all just go back to having lots of young people again. And I went, did I quite hear that correctly? And what it reminded me is that the things that we take for granted are not the things that a lot of people, smart, dedicated people in agencies necessarily understand. So I think there is a role, not just about, how does population play out in this sort of way, but it's also about actually saying, population matters, and it matters in terms of the investments that we make or the impacts that we have on our critical infrastructure, housing being one of those, and of course the environment being the other.
I probably don't have a lot to add, except I would say one thing, and this does emerge from this specific focus on migration, which is different in some ways from other population processes, and that is that I would, in response to that comment, I'd say that policy shapes population as well. And so then the politics of policy making and government practice shapes population. Now I know that's particularly apparent in immigration, because immigration settings are, especially in a country like New Zealand where there's effectively no irregular flows, immigration policy is set and shapes who can arrive and the conditions under which they can be here. But I suspect that we could elaborate that out further, and to Kay's point when you spoke, to be thinking about the conditions under which populations live actually also play a role in population processes. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about population, that we think about what is state practice and what a broader political economic setting's doing to shaping population processes, so not just seeing them as a ongoing thing that we then seek to explain.
The fact that the question, do we need a population policy, has been asked for like the last 50 years. I think it probably was asked at the first gathering of the PANZ Council. And yet we haven't progressed much. Probably confirms that it's a bit of a dead duck, Phil. However, I think there is a shared consensus that population matters. How does it matter? Is the best way so if we have a shared consensus that population matters, that we have some major challenges that are either population related or population driven, and that we need to try and understand that and respond to that and adapt to that in some coherent, strategic way. Then to me it doesn't really matter if you call it a population policy or whether it's a more diffuse way of tackling that's explicitly values-based. What matters is that you find some way to articulate that in a way that is relevant and then try to implement some pathway towards meaningfully addressing that. And that's what we don't see. There's a lot of itsy-bitsy stuff going on around the edges, but none of it fundamentally places population at the centre. And I think the point of departure for me would be actually you do need to place population. I prefer to speak of that as people at the centre, but people through a demographic lens. I think it's actually really important. And I think it's missing from a lot of decision making. And if it's not for a body of PANZ who have spent a lot of their careers trying to untangle, maybe from a challenge perspective and maybe from a problematic perspective. I mean, there's a whole range of, I think, approaches to this, can't sort of get it together and find a way to frame it in a way that's relevant, then nobody else is going to, I think. So I do think there's a need. I think that the average sort of layperson, if you said population policy, they might go to sleep, you're right, or they might have a knee-jerk reaction because when you say the words together, population policy, people think it's something around birth control. Or, in the current environment of disinformation, I think it would set off a lot of, it would frame it in a discourse that's very unhelpful, population policy. And if we thought about it carefully, it probably is not the sensible approach anyway, a singular population policy. But I think probably the bigger point is that we think that population matters in a range of ways. We think that appreciation for that is probably lacking in a lot of places where it needs to be. How do you bring it back into conversation and decision making in a way that's actually coherent and strategic and leads to some sort of action? PANZ isn't going to achieve that, of course, but maybe there's a role for PANZ 50 years in to do something that can speak to that challenge, I suppose, that you've put forward, Phil. Yes.
Interesting point, I think, Phil, that you've raised, but I'm inclined to say it matters enormously that we have a very holistic perspective on people, and if you just focus on particular issues to do with segments of the population, you won't have that. You'll also find that lobbies and certain groups will be very powerful in pushing particular interests for particular groups, and you'll lose the focus on that much wider perspective on people that you've articulated, I think, Tahu. I think there is a very interesting opportunity for PANZ in its 50th year to address a number of things that have been raised here today. I thought Kay's final slide is a perfect slide to illustrate in a very specific way the interdependence of so many things that we talk about when we talk about population. And maybe a question for PANZ in looking at this year and looking out is, why have we been unable to get a coherent set of principles and ideas around our population and where our population is going in the last 50 years? And it's not for want of trying. And it's not, in my view, I disagree with Phil when it's dead. It's not that it's a dead end. It's a really critical time. And Len put his finger on this when he said there are so many things going on that are relevant for thinking around your population, which after all is what policy is about. It's about addressing issues to do with your people. And on the side, you've got, and it's always on the side, you've got the environment, you've got all sorts of other species that inhabit this earth, but in essence, it's all around dealing with one species, and that's humanity. And if we, as demographers, look at that species, and we look at it in a broad, holistic perspective, we're actually looking at something that we do know quite a lot about, its dynamics and how it changes and the implications of those changes, particularly through the analysis of populations and their structures. So coming to the end of this rather sort of wavy comment is there a place for reflection on where did the human face go? Where did the population conference go? Where did the Dominion population conference go? Why didn't some of these major initiatives to try and understand better populations lead to not much that lasted? And I would add in there the work that was referred to by the Population Monitoring Group, because that was a decade of work focusing on people and wiped out at the stroke of a pen in the same way as the ferries were. It was actually by an incoming Minister of Finance who decided there's one line in this budget that should go, and it was a Quango line. And Bill Birch wiped out pretty well all Quangos in one big red line without asking a single question about what was their value, what did they actually deliver, and what do we replace them with? And they never replaced them. So I think there's plenty of scope for PANZ, and I think I agree with Tahu, maybe population policy in the singular is not the way to look at it, and population understandings, and there's some language needs to be put around this that captures the central point for why have we got all this policy in the first place.
Thanks.
And this might have to be our last comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, because I was also thinking about these PMG reports, and one of the ones that I think was really important was about emphasizing diversity. And I think the media have this big, I get very upset sometimes when you read commentators talking about population, because they either talk about a modal, some concept of some average, and the other thing is to talk about a really specific group, but they never then put it in the context of the general. So I think there's a real problem in making understanding of diversity that is demographically driven.
So thank you very much. What we just wanted to do, I'll just thank everyone, we were keen to get some reflections from people around what you liked about the day and what you would be interested in seeing a bit more of in the future.
Sorry, I'm just trying to turn the screen off.
So if anyone, we can pass the mic around, but first I'd just like to say thank you. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to say thank you to Tahu, but I have reflected a lot on everything that you've said. And Francis, your words on migration have always stuck with me from, I think it was the 29 conference where you talked about the exploitation of Filipino workers and the attitudes of them. And we had at the last year's conference, we had Ganesh Nana talking about actually the policy of making a nest for people, that we have people coming in, they're not just workers, they're people, they have families, and they want to develop and build a life. And I think that identifying the sort of inequality that we have, we actually had in the General Social Survey in 2018, when we were asking people about access to healthcare, we had some comments in saying, I'm not eligible. And so, that strikes with me. And so it's about that interconnectedness of people and place, and putting people's well-being and tītariti at the centre of it. That if we have that manaakitanga that towards everyone within the country, and we think about everyone's well-being, that is where understanding population, understanding place, understanding people's rights and needs for kind of housing and well-being, and their dignity is just central to what a population and understanding is about and what PANZ is about. And so I'd like to thank you very much for that, and for all our other speakers. To me, it's been a really exciting and thoughtful, not just nostalgic, but very thought-provoking day. So I'd like to say thank you to the panel, and thank you to our speakers, and also for all of you for arriving here.